Hey there, welcome to the channel, Patucation. I'm the host of this channel, Patrick, but you can call me Pat if you'd prefer. I hope this episode will be informative and interesting because it's about a topic that lies very close to my heart, namely, my seething hatred for fascism. Specifically, this episode is about the Sweden Democrats, a far-right political party in Sweden, as well as how the far-right is infiltrating Swedish politics. With introductions out of the way and a clear understanding of what the episode is about, let's dive right in. 1939 is probably burned into everyone's memory as the start of World War II, one of the bloodiest wars in human history. The war ended with the discovery of Nazi death camps, where millions of human beings had been tortured and murdered. Nazi Germany was responsible for death and suffering on an unimaginable scale, the Holocaust. Yet it is difficult to grasp how human beings could be capable of such despicable evil. The Holocaust, I fear, is often viewed as some sort of reductive, inevitable evil of history that just happened because sometimes evil things happen, rather than being the result of ideas, attitudes, and actions held and committed by far right extremists, far right sympathizers, and collaborators. We can sit here all day and discuss guilt and blame, which Germans were to blame and which ones were not, which ones were just fighting for their country or just following orders, and which ones were the truly bad Nazis. But the complicity of the Nazi paramilitary organization, the Schutzstaffel, SS, and its combat branch, Waffen-SS, should not be in question, as they directly executed the Holocaust and engaged in war crimes and crimes against humanity in Nazi Germany's racist war to create Lebensraum for the white Aryan race. That complicity didn't stop at the German border, however. You can say a lot about Swedish neutrality during World War II, but between 1939 and 1941, the Nazis secretly recruited Swedish volunteers at the German embassy in Stockholm. It is estimated that between 150 and 330 Swedes volunteered to fight for Nazi Germany as part of Waffen SS. Although it might not seem like many in the grand scheme of things, it is absolutely shameful. What's more shameful is that upon return home, the Waffen SS volunteers faced almost no consequences whatsoever, integrating back into civilian life after having participated in abhorrent crimes against humanity, voluntarily, because they agreed with Nazi Germany's evil far-right ideology. And they mostly got to keep living, free to go about their lives and continue to spread their violent, hateful ideology. That's the thing, the Holocaust is not just an unimaginable evil that happened at once and couldn't possibly happen again. It absolutely could happen again. And that's what's so scary about the increasing popularity of far-right populism, alt-right fascism, neo-Nazism, whatever you want to call it, all around the globe. Like the victory in Italy for Giorgia Meloni, who quite literally is a fascist who praised Mussolini as a good leader who did what he did for Italy. That's scary because genocide is the logical conclusion of far-right racist and fascist ideology, the logical conclusion of ethno-nationalism and white supremacy, the logical conclusion of loaded, dehumanizing language aimed at vulnerable minority groups, whether it be Jews, Romani, Arabic refugees, or trans people. The war and the Holocaust ended in 1945 after 6 million Jews and other minorities had been systematically murdered by the brutal Nazi regime. 1945 was a long time ago, and although Nazi Germany is a thing of the past, Nazism and fascism never went away. It is now 2023. On September 11th of last year, we had an election in Sweden. The election was historic, really, because the far-right Sweden Democrats outperformed the otherwise largest right-wing conservative party, the Moderate Party, for the first time ever, and thus became the second largest political party in Swedish politics, with 20.54% of the total vote, roughly 1 in 5 Swedes. The election was a nail biter, a tight race between two political blocs, the red green left wing and environmentalist parties, and the blue brown right wing conservative and fascist parties, with just 3 seats in parliament separating the two in favor of the blue brown bloc. While the Sweden Democrats have already had a very negative effect on Swedish politics, this is the first time they have been able to directly extract political concessions from the majority bloc. A scary prospect indeed. The aim of this video is to do a deep dive in the history and goals of the Sweden Democrats. That's history with direct ties to Nazi Germany, by the way, and discuss how the traditional blue conservative parties act as enablers of the Sweden Democrats' fascism. First, we need to go over some of the basics of Swedish politics. Sweden is a parliamentary representative democracy. Political power in Sweden lies in parliament, riksdagen in Swedish, as well as the government, regeringen in Swedish. The government is the executive branch and directly governs the country, but exists by the tolerance of parliament. Parliament votes in the prime minister, who in turn forms the government by appointing ministers at their own discretion. What this system means is that blocs or coalitions tend to form in order to gain a majority in parliament and thus get to form the government. Traditionally, there are a red-green bloc of leftists and environmentalists, and a blue bloc of right-wing liberals and conservatives. However, because blocs are coalitions of different parties, usually 3 or 4 with nuances in their politics, in order to reach an agreement on the politics of the new government, concessions have to be made across party lines but along bloc lines. So, the two blocs that traditionally form are a left-wing bloc consisting of the Left Party, the Green Party, and the Social Democratic Party, and a right-wing bloc consisting of the Center Party, Liberals, Christian Democrats, and the Moderates. Then the Sweden Democrats have stood outside the mainstream blocs without any other parties wanting to work with them because of their xenophobia and racism. Until lately, that is. The growth of the Sweden Democrats has changed the political landscape of Sweden. Not only has it led to a rightward shift of nearly all other political parties, except perhaps the Left Party, the Green Party, and the Center Party, but it has also changed the political coalitions that form between the parties. The Sweden Democrats have the last 2 elections been more and more welcomed into the right-wing bloc, which has caused the left fringe of the right to instead seek a coalition with the proper left. The last government, for example, was created by a strange coalition of the Social Democratic Party, the Green Party, the Center Party, and the Liberals, taking many, many months after the 2018 election to actually successfully come to an agreement and vote in a prime minister and create a new government. It was concern over the far-right politics of the Sweden Democrats and a refusal to form a government with them that led to this strange coalition, a coalition that ultimately struggled to work together meaningfully because of broad political differences. For the Center Party, opposition to the Sweden Democrats' fascism has pushed them toward the red-green bloc and away from the blue bloc. This last election, antifascism was a big part of their electoral strategy. As for the Liberals, they have espoused for years their opposition to extremist fringe politics and, like the Center Party, aligned themselves with the Social Democratic Party to form the last government, but extracting concessions from the left to do so. This last election in 2022, the Liberals decided to do a 180 on their supposed anti-fascism and instead signaled their desire for a right-wing government of the Moderate Party, the Christian Democrats, and themselves, propped up by the far-right Sweden Democrats. Where far-right extremism was recently something the Liberals called out, tepidly at least, now they see a path to power and tax cuts by making concessions to the far-right neo-fascist party, because they probably realize that never again will the mainstream right get enough votes on their own to win, not without also including the far-right in their coalition. Once upon a time, no party would work with the Sweden Democrats because they were perceived as extremists, which they are, of course. But now, three of the mainstream right wing parties are willing to work with the Sweden Democrats and make huge policy concessions to them. The moderate party, the Christian Democrats, and the Liberals now all find the Sweden Democrats with the 20.54% of the vote an appealing ally in parliament, even if they stop just short of allowing the Sweden Democrats ministerial posts in the new government. As if that matters at all, given how much of the new government's politics have been decided by concessions to the Sweden Democrats. More on that later. Why is this concerning? Why is it concerning that right wing parties work with another right wing party? Well, it's simply because the Sweden Democrats are not just another right wing party. They are a far right fascist party, both in their history as a party, and we'll go over that in a minute, as well as in their current politics, their current ideology, goals, and strategies. Some of you who are listening might already be typing in the comments, "You leftists call everyone you disagree with fascists." Hold that thought for a little while and let's first talk about the Sweden Democrats and go over their history as well as the history of white power and neo-Nazism in Sweden, because it's all connected really. The Sweden Democrats first became relevant roughly 12 years ago in 2010, when they first got into parliament. They were around a bit longer than that, and their history arguably reaches back much, much further to the very beginnings of Nazism. But it was during the late 80s that the Sweden Democrats were officially founded. Now, during the 1980s and 1990s, the white power movement was growing in Sweden, especially with the popularization of white power music in certain subcultures, such as the skinhead subculture. White power is an explicitly racist and fascist movement that advocates for the supremacy of white people over people of color. Although mostly a loose subculture defined by white supremacist thought, several far-right organizations and political parties grew alongside the white power movement or directly from it. Some examples of fascist and neo-Nazi organizations in Sweden at the time were White Aryan Resistance, the Nordic Resistance Movement, Party of the Swedes, the Progress Party, Keep Sweden Swedish, the Sweden Party, and, of course, the Sweden Democrats. In Swedish, these names would be Vitt ariskt motstånd, Nordiska motståndsrörelsen, Svenskarnas parti, Framstegspartiet, Bevara Sverige svenskt, Sverigepartiet, and Sverigedemokraterna. As you can probably tell, a lot of these organizations hammer on the same note right there in the name, a kind of vague gesture toward an ethnic identity, an ethno-nationalist notion of what it means to be Swedish or Nordic. Some, of course, are more obvious with their neo-Nazism than others, but all of them push a narrative of us versus them, white Swedish people versus brown non-Swedes and foreigners that want to change what Sweden is. There is no doubt that these organizations were fascist, and that the ones that still exist today, like the Sweden Democrats, still are fascist. Take White Aryan Resistance and the Nordic Resistance Movement, for example. I don't think I have to explain why White Aryan Resistance is neo-Nazi, right? The organization was active in Sweden from 1991 to 1993, but eventually fell apart when several members were sentenced to prison. 4 years later, in 1997, when some of these imprisoned Nazis were getting out of prison, they formed the Nordic Resistance Movement, or at least the Swedish chapter of it. This is a Nordic organization that is still active today. This is an organization that, like its predecessor, is openly neo-Nazi, an organization that engages in Holocaust denial and has harassed survivors of the Holocaust, an organization that has been involved in dozens of hate crimes and acts of terrorism, and an organization that thinks that, quote, the only horrible or shameful thing about young Swedes harming or killing foreigners and enemies, read leftists, is that all other Swedes do not support them, end quote. This is a violent, extremist, neo-Nazi organization that did and still does play an active role in the white power movement. Next, let's talk about the Party of the Swedes. With this neo Nazi political party, we can see an interesting trend that will be of utmost relevance when we get to the Sweden Democrats. The name of the party is an implicitly racist name that implies a racist ideology. Now, there's no doubt that this party is fascist, they even said so themselves, and as part of their political platform in 2011, you could find rhetoric like, quote, Sweden must also be Swedish in the future. Only people who belong to the Western genetic and cultural heritage, which includes ethnic Swedes, must be able to be Swedish citizens, end quote. And, quote, Sweden must be governed by the Swedes. Non Swedes must not be allowed to hold positions of power within Swedish society, end quote. As well as, quote, Sweden must be governed for the Swedes. All political decisions must be based on what is best for the interests of the ethnic Swedes, end quote. But the name itself, Party of the Swedes, is vague enough as to allow plausible deniability about any direct connection to Nazism, and thus be more likely to appeal to the average, mildly xenophobic and nationalist Swede. You want to know what the Party of the Swedes was originally called back in the 1990s? National Socialist Front. Nationalsocialistisk Front. Literally, Nazi Front. Fascism can appeal to a harmful reactionary instinct and fear of change and what's different. But explicit Nazism is not palatable, not after the Holocaust, not after mass murder on an unimaginable scale. People will not outright support genocide, and some fascists understand that and operate based on that knowledge. Keep Sweden Swedish was another racist neo Nazi organization created in 1979. This is one of the parties that was a direct predecessor to the Sweden Democrats, the party that now has roughly 20% of the vote. Just the name Keep Sweden Swedish is a racist call to action and a slogan the Sweden Democrats would keep using until the end of the 1990s. If you have any doubt about whether or not the organization Keep Sweden Swedish was racist and fascist, take a look at the sticker promoting the organization. It says, quote, Warning, 2 Swedish girls. Avoid unprotected intercourse with N-words who carry deadly AIDS. Preferably do not dishonor your race, your Sweden, your family, or your relatives. Have an abortion only if necessary. Keep Sweden Swedish. End quote. The obvious implications here are that non-white people are dirty, that sex with non-whites is dishonorable, and that a baby born to a white woman and a non-white man would be impure, not Swedish enough. Obvious fascist bigotry to all of you, I should hope. The stated political goals of Keep Sweden Swedish were to limit immigration and repatriate immigrants currently living in Sweden, both of which are goals the Sweden Democrats still have as their core agenda. On their official website today, the Sweden Democrats state, quote, In order to restore Sweden to what it once was, it is necessary both for immigration to decrease and for return migration to increase, end quote. Take note here of a common fascist trope, the unsubstantiated belief that there once was a time when the country was good that must be restored by getting rid of certain demographics of people. Fascism is both a flawed axiomatic belief in a perfect past that must be returned to even though it never really existed, and another flawed axiomatic belief that there is now social degeneracy caused by deviance from their preferred social order, whether that be gay people existing, brown people existing, women existing as more than props or items of conquest, or men not adhering to some exaggerated masculine ideal. Fascists tend to believe in degeneracy above all else, defining it by social changes they oppose based on their ultra-conservative values. So, degeneracy is when there's civil rights for LGBTQ people, or when there's feminism, or when there's immigration. And that is very obvious in the beliefs and rhetoric of all of the fascist organizations that I've mentioned thus far, and in the rhetoric of the Sweden Democrats even to this day. Another organization that preceded the Sweden Democrats that I just want to touch upon briefly was the Progress Party, a political party that during the 1980s focused more and more on xenophobic politics. In 1986, the Progress Party and Keep Sweden Swedish merged to form the Sweden Party. This would not last long because, as is often the case with fascist organizations, it fell apart because of infighting. Several party officials that joined the Sweden Party from the Progress Party side of the merge were expelled from the party, including Stefan Herman, who was the party leader for the Sweden Party. Among the ones expelled was also Peter Pedersen, against whom there was resentment because he was given a leading role in the party despite being a foreigner. What kind of foreigner, from where, I'm not sure, I couldn't find a good source, but based on the name, it sounds like he was from a Nordic country, which apparently isn't Swedish enough either to some people. You can't make this shit up. Anyway, even though the merge had failed, a new fascist party rose from the rubble, the Sweden Democrats. It is now the year 1988. All of the organizations and parties we've talked about existed parallel to each other against a backdrop of the white power movement. The Sweden Democrats were founded from the ashes of fascist parties that operated in the white power movement, existed alongside and shared support with other fascist organizations like the Nordic Resistance Movement and the Party of the Swedes. This history is utterly contemptible for a mainstream political party to carry. But that's not all. Let's talk about some of the specific founders and members of the Sweden Democrats. Obviously, most founders and members came from the aforementioned fascist organizations and the white power movement. These are hateful and violent people such as Ulf Ranshede, who not only was an active participant in the white power movement, and was convicted of assault and battery 5 times, including after an unprovoked attack on a 14-year-old immigrant boy, but also served as chairman for the first annual meeting of the Sweden Democrats in Malmö in 1988, and coined their name, the Sweden Democrats. But that's hardly the worst of the Sweden Democrats. No, what's probably the most appalling, worse even than the connection to the white power movement and contemporary neo-Nazi organizations, is the direct connection that the Sweden Democrats have to Nazi Germany. Early on in the video, I talked about World War II, I talked about the Holocaust, I talked about the explicit Nazi paramilitary organization called the Schutzstaffel, SS, and how it was complicit in the worst atrocities of Nazi Germany. And I talked about Swedish volunteers joining Waffen-SS, fighting for Nazi Germany, and returning to Sweden with very few consequences for their genocidal actions, if any consequences at all. One of these volunteers, a Waffen-SS veteran, was Gustav Ekström, one of the founders of the Sweden Democrats. This is someone who literally traveled to Nazi Germany and volunteered to fight for the Nazis, someone who chose to give aid to a genocidal far-right regime and commit heinous crimes against humanity by murdering Jews and other minorities. He was one of the founders of the Sweden Democrats, a literal Nazi who volunteered to fight for Nazi Germany during World War II, during the Holocaust. A person who volunteered to help the Nazis exterminate millions of Jews and other minorities and attempt to take over Europe to create Lebensraum for the white Aryan race. How does a party recover from this disgusting history? I don't think it can. Perhaps the most significant figure in the Sweden Democrats is party leader Jimmy Åkesson. According to an SVT poll from 2022, where the dark gray indicates great significance and the light gray indicates little significance of the party leader to voters, the party leader is of great significance to voters of the Sweden Democrats. 80% consider him important, the highest percentage of all the parties. He's kind of a cult of personality among the Sweden Democrats. Perhaps not from my point of view personally, a charismatic salesman of nationalist, xenophobic politics. According to Jimmy, he joined the Sweden Democrats in 1995, just after Anders Klarström stepped down as party leader. Klarström was an open neo-Nazi who associated with far-right terrorists, like White Aryan Resistance, for example. Supposedly, this was a renewal of the Sweden Democrats away from neo Nazism toward um, just xenophobic bigotry, I guess. Just the exact same policy goals as when they were Nazis, but now they say they're not Nazis anymore. Even though the Sweden Democrats dressed in Nazi uniforms, donned Nazi flags, and burned books about the Holocaust in 1996, supposedly they weren't Nazis anymore when Jimmy joined in 1995. But according to Expo, on a members' bulletin for a local Sweden Democrat youth organization in 1997, Jimmy himself wrote that he was involved in the local chapter's founding in 1994, when the Sweden Democrats still had an openly neo Nazi leader. The current party leader of the Sweden Democrats is, in other words, someone who willingly and knowingly joined a neo Nazi party in his youth and has remained in this party ever since. During the early years after he joined, Nazi iconography was still commonplace, yet he would have you believe that he never was a fascist or a fascist sympathizer. This is the legacy the Sweden Democrats carry with them: neo-Nazi founders, involvement in white power and fascist movements, association with far-right terrorist organizations, and direct ties to Nazi Germany through a founding member who actually volunteered to fight for Nazi Germany. This is a legacy that they can't sweep away by exchanging their brown shirts for suits and ties instead. But this is a legacy the Sweden Democrats have worked hard to hide and make the Swedish public forget, and forgotten it has been, by the mainstream right that now builds a coalition with them, by the media and political establishment that don't offer nearly enough critical reporting on how and why the Sweden Democrats' politics are abhorrent and dangerous, and by 20% of Swedes who now blame all of their problems, real or imagined, on the influx of brown refugees fleeing war and poverty, perhaps one of the most vulnerable and disenfranchised demographics of people in the world. As an example of establishment voices downplaying the danger that the Sweden Democrats and other fascist parties around the world actually pose, danger to people of color, to our democratic institutions, and to the freedom we take for granted, I want to take a look at a couple of so-called experts who, indeed, have forgotten the legacy of the Sweden Democrats and, in my opinion, seem rather confused about what fascism even is. On the Swedish Wikipedia page for the Sweden Democrats, in the section on the Sweden Democrats' placement on a left-right spectrum, you may read about the opinions of political scientist Sören Holmberg and sociologist Göran Adamsson. Holmberg said in February 2021 that extreme right isn't a good description of the party's position on such a spectrum because, on some issues, they are not to the right of the mainstream right-wing political parties, for example on elderly care. Holmberg said that they're populist, but that many other parties are too, and instead said that National Conservative fit better. Furthermore, Adamsson pontificated that whoever conflates the Sweden Democrats' social conservatism with right-wing extremism is showing deep ignorance, and that the party tends to be more liberal. He found no proof that the Sweden Democrats were illiberal, anti-democratic, or fascist. What's especially funny to me is that he wrote his dissertation on right-wing populism in Europe, yet he obviously has very little understanding of what fascism is and how fascism operates. So here's a great place in the video to discuss what fascism is, in my opinion, because there really isn't one commonly accepted definition of it. Fascism isn't an economic ideology, first of all. It's true that on economic issues, the Sweden Democrats are all over the place and could be placed on some issues to the left of the mainstream right-wing parties. But that is missing the forest for the trees. Economics is secondary to fascists. It is usually a means to an end, the end being achieving power, promoting ultranationalist and ultraconservative values, and expelling or murdering the undesirables. What fascism is to me is actually rather simple. It is ideological bigotry, ideological xenophobia, ideological racism, ideological misogyny, ideological homophobia, ideological transphobia, etc. Fascism is conscious bigotry toward a certain group of people and policy goals by which to get rid of or oppress this group of people. This is a definition into which the Sweden Democrats undeniably, categorically fit. Given their strong historical ties to not just fascism and neo Nazism, but in fact original Nazism, and a modern political platform whose core concern to this day is the influx of brown people into Swedish society, how could anyone argue that the Sweden Democrats' national conservatism and their social conservatism are not right wing extremism? How can anyone look at a party that is arguing that refugees should not be brought in and that people with an immigration background that currently live here should be encouraged to repatriate so Sweden can return to greatness, read whiteness, see a party that isn't illiberal or anti-democratic or fascist? But I think that's the problem. The Sweden Democrats have become, as we say in Sweden, rumsrena, in other words, whitewashed and mainstream. So much so that, indeed, their fascist past has been collectively forgotten and the clear fascist values that underpin their modern politics are ignored. They've become an accepted part of institutional Swedish politics. And I do think a lot of people, even academics, operate under the assumption that mainstream institutional parties cannot be extremists or fascists, almost by definition. A pro status quo bias, if you will, one that I do not agree with, obviously. To further understand what fascism is, or at least how I see it, we should also understand what a left right spectrum is, because I do think that some people tend to overcomplicate things, which leads them to a faulty conclusion that a far right party is in fact not far right. And that only serves the far right party because far right is colloquially understood as violent extremism. Muddying the waters of the left right spectrum only helps the far right seem less extreme than they are. A left right spectrum is an extremely simplified version of complex politics, of course, but politics can generally be categorized as left and right, where certain ideas and beliefs share similar values and axioms and can thus be placed on the same side. You don't really need to invent more dimensions by which to categorize because I think that often leads to confusion and missing the forest for the trees. Categorizing social values, libertarianism versus authoritarianism on a y axis and economics on an x axis tends to miss the point, in my opinion. Kind of in the same way that horseshoe theory fails. Why I think this is because social values and economic values tend to operate based on the same axioms. The axiom underlying all left wing politics, whether social or economic, is the belief in the self evident truth that all human beings are equal and that equality is desirable. Meanwhile, right wing social values and right wing economic values are both fundamentally built on hierarchy, the axiomatic belief that hierarchy is natural and desirable. This is the case for both fascism and capitalism, the only difference being what kind of hierarchy is being built. And this is a point I think is often missed by people who overcategorize and overthink. And this is why someone might come to the conclusion that the Sweden Democrats are not far right extremists, despite their entire political existence hinging on the notion that immigration, and by extension immigrants, are bad and destroying Swedish culture and way of life. The Sweden Democrats believe in a hierarchy of human beings, of Swedes, based on categories of race and ethnicity, where certain people are more Swedish and others are less, and where the ones who are lesser than are also the cause of Sweden's problems, real or imagined. This is a hierarchy, one that dehumanizes entire demographics of people, and thus it is far-right extremism. I need everyone to hear me on this, so let me repeat that. The Sweden Democrats are fascist because they categorically believe that brown immigrants are dangerous and inferior to white Swedes, which is a fascist hierarchy and an underlying axiom that can and absolutely will be used to justify genocide if the Sweden Democrats ever achieve real institutional power. Another thing that I think is most prudent to discuss is not just what fascism is, but also how it operates, especially how it operates in the 21st century. Specifically, we're going to talk about a strategy that is often consciously employed by many contemporary fascists, a strategy that can be summarized as such. Fascists lie. They lie all the time about everything. They especially lie about their actual fascist beliefs. They downplay them and use dog whistles and try to pull people to the right little by little. This is a strategy you'd think a sociologist and a political scientist ought to be aware of, at least if they're going to open their mouths to talk about right wing populism, which is, of course, another term for fascism. This strategy can also explain why fascists tend to place all over the spectrum on economics. You see, well, they lie. It is not uncommon for fascists to co opt left wing rhetoric in order to mask their far right bigotry and make it more palatable. Hell, there's even been entire left wing movements that have been co opted by far right fascists, which has led to the creation of some of the most authoritarian and fascist regimes in existence, like Russia, for example. Far right demagogues tend to steal left wing rhetoric they can easily strip of any meaningful left wing subtext and instead insert their own far right subtext into. Like Trump lying about protecting jobs for American workers and using this rhetoric to espouse xenophobic views about foreigners, immigrants, and geopolitical enemies like China. But once in power, he did nothing to protect workers because that was just rhetoric to make his ugly views more palatable. Or like the Nazi Party that was officially called the National Socialist German Workers' Party and initially focused on anti big business, anti bourgeois, and anti capitalist rhetoric in order to pull workers away from actual left wing politics and toward ethno nationalism. Yet in power, the Nazis cracked down hard on unions. Because fascists lie, they lie a lot, all the time. This is a well known strategy of fascism and shouldn't be news to well educated political scientists and sociologists. As a tangent, another reason fascists may place all over the spectrum on economic issues could be that they tend to be authoritarian in nature and thus wish to use the state to promote their interests, whatever they may be. This is categorically different from a socialist or welfare state because a fascist state is tightly controlled by a small subset of private actors, i.e., the dictator or dictators, whereas a socialist or welfare state is publicly owned. This is why China, Russia, and North Korea are fascist, in my opinion, not really socialist or communist at all. This is why Hitler built the Autobahn. Sometimes fascists use their state power to do things that aren't evil, but usually they do things that are evil. A fascist could, in theory, believe that some left wing economic policies, like public transportation or a housing program, are good. But generally, they don't actually believe that because they fundamentally believe in hierarchy and only really pursue economic policies if they believe it will bring them closer to power, further cement their power once they get it, or aid in their primary goals of creating ultra-conservative ethno-states. But that's kind of a tangent, so let's get back to the fascist strategy of lying and trying to portray themselves as less extreme and more palatable than they actually are. I wonder if there's a quote we can use here. Right, Ingmar Somberg, another Swedish Nazi volunteer and Waffen-SS veteran, said in 1998, and I quote, "Keep in mind that the Nazi symbolism from the 1930s is no longer viable. Hang up the uniform, put down the beer can, and stop shouting about the slaughter of Jews." End quote. This is not a denouncement of Nazism, anti-Semitism, white supremacy, or the Holocaust. No, this was advice to Swedish Nazis. This is the fascist strategy of the late 20th and 21st centuries. Downplay and conceal the most egregious aspects of your fascism and instead introduce it as more palatable bite-sized bits and pieces of propaganda, thereby slowly priming people to accept more and more of your beliefs as normal, normalizing fascist beliefs, and moving the Overton window further and further right to the point where fascism becomes mainstream. This is exactly what happened in the US with a Republican Party that is now explicitly fascist, hardly even bothering to use dog whistles anymore. And this is what I fear is happening in Swedish politics as well, what has already been happening to a certain extent. There is this misconception that fascists and neo Nazis are dumb, but they're not. Well, not all of them. They operate under a different set of axioms, really, really awful axioms, but they are not all stupid. They understand that their views in raw form are extremely unpopular and perceived as evil. They understand that they have to downplay their true intentions and wrap their ideology bit by bit in rhetoric. They know as well as we know how deeply, deeply horrific the Holocaust is viewed by normal people. And by normal here, I mean, people who aren't Nazis. You can see this in Swedish politics. Fascist movements and organizations have two tendencies from what I can see. They either self destruct and fall apart, or they reorganize away from the most explicit forms of fascism toward something optically less egregious. Explicit fascist organizations have come and gone, but none have ever come close to 20.54% of the vote like the Sweden Democrats, let alone even 1%. So fascists have moved on to a new strategy of trying to take on the appearance of non-extremism in order to gain both popular as well as institutional support and power. I already gave the National Socialist Front rebranding as the Party of the Swedes as an example, but no Nazi organization has really been all that successful at rebranding and shedding their public perception of neo-Nazism. Until the Sweden Democrats, that is. Because the Sweden Democrats have absolutely taken Ingmar Sundberg's advice to heart. Some people would use the actions they have taken over the years as proof of change, but to me it appears very obvious that they have, over the course of a couple of decades, led a concerted effort to whitewash their legacy and their identity, trying to move away from their explicitly fascist origins while still holding on to a legacy of xenophobic bigotry, shown in their anti-immigration agenda that is the core of their political platform every single election. Although anti-immigration is putting it mildly, almost giving it an aura of respectability as just concern over too much immigration, when in reality it is concern over changing culture and ethnic makeup, a concern that both the culture and the people are becoming too brown amid an imagined flood of undesirable immigrants who are biologically essentially primed to rape and murder white women, mooch off of the welfare system built by hardworking whites, yet also steal important jobs from white people. But it is this way of putting it mildly that they are banking on, being perceived as less and less extreme by optically distancing themselves from their past and the most overt fascists that have been kicked out of the party for not getting with the program of appearing more respectable. To put it another way, the Sweden Democrats have engaged in a war of optics against the more egregious and less strategically suave of the fascists among them. The Sweden Democrats have, over the course of a couple of decades, ousted members embroiled in controversies of a far-right nature, at least when they felt they optically had to. They've distanced themselves as much as they can from their past while holding on to a political agenda of anti-immigration, and in so doing have not just themselves become mainstream, but have brought anti-immigrant bigotry into mainstream politics, where you can now openly argue that immigrants are destroying Swedish culture without being labeled a fascist or a racist, despite this being a fascist dog whistle that dehumanizes and demonizes refugees, immigrants, and indeed just brown people. Obviously, it's not 1988 anymore, but the legacy of white supremacy, racism, and neo-Nazism should be the lens through which you read the Sweden Democrats' modern political platform. Because despite decades of trying to clean up their image, the core agenda remains the same: fearmonger about immigrants, refugees, and people of color, paint them as criminals and scary foreign forces intent on changing what Sweden is supposed to be, drive a wedge between the good ethnic Swedes and the non-Swedes that are taking over the country, blame all of society's ills on immigration and thus immigrants. And it seems that despite removing the clumsy Nazis among them that have been swept up in very public controversies after exposing their explicit fascist beliefs, there are always more Nazis among them that can keep getting swept up in public controversies, almost as if neo-Nazism runs deep in the political identity of the Sweden Democrats. Some of the many controversies over the years include assaulting Swedes with an immigration background, calling immigrants parasites, saying people from the Middle East have violent genes, referring to people from Africa as apes, brandishing armbands with the Nazi swastika, and verbally harassing, assaulting, and threatening people while armed with iron pipes. Despite the most publicly controversial figures sometimes having to leave the party and instead forming offshoots that are more overtly racist and fascist, the Sweden Democrats keep attracting far right types and keep having party members that become involved in racist controversies. In 2017, for example, party member Martin Strid said that Muslims are not 100% human. Or as recently as October 28th of last year, after this last election, Rebecca Adel of the Sweden Democrats stepped down from her position after she was exposed for spreading Nazi propaganda. A joint report by the Express and Expo alleges that Rebecca worked for the Nordic resistance movement's website Nordfront, proofreading and writing far-right propaganda under a pseudonym, as well as describing herself as a National Socialist, Nazi, and encouraging the site's readers to, quote, get ready for the Nazi struggle, end quote. Or alternatively, getting ready for the Nazi fight or Nazi war, depending on how you translate the word kamp. The Sweden Democrats have optically attempted to distance themselves from their historical ties to the white power movement and overt fascism, yet they can't really seem to get away from it because it isn't genuine. Toning down your rhetoric and purging party members with bad optics are strategies employed by modern alt-right fascists. It doesn't make them less fascist. When the core of their politics still is anti-immigration, xenophobia, racism, and nationalism, they haven't meaningfully changed from their days of open fascism. In 2022, the Sweden Democrats campaigned on a platform that was about making Sweden good again, and that they're not like the other parties. Claiming they won't be satisfied with making Sweden better, they want Sweden to be good again. They talked about destructive development, sometimes pointing to real problems, sometimes exaggerated problems, and usually imagined problems. I'd like to remind you here about fascists' tendency to believe in degeneracy, the idea that society is falling apart because of immoral or unnatural social changes. But they often conflate this supposed degeneracy with actual issues, which is why I talk about real imagined or exaggerated problems. For example, crime is a big political issue in Sweden. A poll in 2021 showed that 4 out of 5 Swedes believe that criminality has significantly increased amid stories in the media of gang-related shootings. Obviously, any number of shootings is an issue, but crime overall hasn't seen a huge uptick at all. Criminologist Manne Gerell explained in 2021 that there always seems to be a significant majority that believe criminality is going up, whether it is actually going up or down. This is something the Sweden Democrats capitalize on by painting a link between criminality and immigration, a vague link that implies more prevalence of crime among immigrants than there actually is. They also blame any actual criminality on essentialist qualities of immigrants as a group rather than sociological issues prevalent in Swedish society, such as anti-immigrant bigotry, for example. The Sweden Democrats also try to link immigration to a worsening economy, claiming that immigration is very expensive. On their official website, they list a number of estimates for costs associated with immigration. Yet Statistics Sweden, Statistiska centralbyrån, SCB, notes that immigration has had a net positive effect on GDP. Furthermore, immigration is an economic boon because adult or near-adult immigrants are, relative to newborn children, cheap. This is because the costs associated with bringing up children, like for example, child benefits and public education, have already been paid for by another country. And adult immigrants are ready to go to work almost right away instead of after 18 or more years worth of investment. Yet nobody complains about how expensive children are for society, because we all know that it is an investment that will give massive returns later in the children's lives. Oh, and we also don't dehumanize white children and base the worthiness of their existence on their public costs, like the Sweden Democrats do with immigrants. The Sweden Democrats' rhetoric focuses mainly on perceived negative effects of immigration, contextualizing it in the sense that it has been bad for us, the real Swedes. They want to limit immigration and refugees to the lowest legally allowed in the European Union. They want to make it easier to deport immigrants, and they want to punish criminals, asocial immigrants, and others that hurt our society with deportation and by stripping citizens with immigration background of their citizenship if they are involved in crime, which may violate international law, by the way. You can't just strip persons of their citizenship willy nilly. What's really gross to me, though, is this hyper focus on specifically people with an immigration background and the lopsidedly cruel way they want to punish them, where it would never even be on the table to strip a white person of their citizenship, or deport a Nazi, for example. I think some people want to look at what they're saying and think, hey, what's so bad about wanting to deport criminals? Well, what's bad about that is that it creates a narrative that paints brown people as inherently criminal, violent, and dangerous. It creates a culture where brown people are not considered real Swedes. They're just here because we allow them and we can take it back whenever. It cements attitudes that brown people are lesser than, not as important, not as human. Even if there aren't swastikas all over it, that is what whitewashed fascism looks like. Rumsrena, yet still operating based on the same axioms and values. Even setting aside the logical conclusion of politics like this, which is the creation of an ethno-state through ethnic cleansing and genocide, an immediate consequence of allowing this type of politics mainstream tolerance is a significant uptick of racist harassment and hate crimes. Personally, I think that's pretty bad. As a last example of how horrible they are, here's an official political ad run by the Sweden Democrats in 2010 that is still up to date on their YouTube channel. It sets up the premise that we either have money for immigration or for pensions, and then we see an elderly white woman running toward the budget, but a large group of foreign women dressed in burqas run past her. This is just fear-mongering and xenophobia, trying to drum up resentment toward immigrants by setting up a false dichotomy where innocent old white ladies are being hurt by dehumanized hordes of immigrants and foreigners. This is the type of party that the Sweden Democrats are. Okay, look, there are plenty of racists in pretty much every party. But there is only one party with strong historical ties to neo-Nazism and a political agenda that is fundamentally xenophobic and racist, even if it is dressed up in a nice, fancy suit instead of a brown shirt or a Nazi uniform. Despite the mainstream right-wing political parties also being socially conservative and leaning into anti-immigration rhetoric and policies more and more, there is only one party that I fully believe is working toward ethnic cleansing and genocide, if they ever get enough power. And that is the Sweden Democrats. But obviously they have a lot of people fooled. I don't believe for a second that 20.54% of Swedes would ever support explicit fascism. But it is not at all unbelievable to me that 20.54% of Swedes might be susceptible to xenophobic or racist propaganda, as long as it at least optically denounces Nazism. I believe that I've made my point. You either see it or you don't. You either understand why the Sweden Democrats are problematic, or you don't. It used to be that more people understood this. The Sweden Democrats first got into parliament in 2010 with 5.7% of the vote, after years of trying to outrun their neo-Nazi image. Over the next 12 years leading up to the 2022 election, the Sweden Democrats grew election after election to a staggering 20.54% of votes, almost 4 times bigger now than they were in 2010. Now the second largest party in Swedish politics, surpassing the moderate party that used to be the second largest party and the largest right-wing party. 1 in 5 Swedes in 2022 voted for the Sweden Democrats, a far-right fascist party. When the Sweden Democrats first got into parliament, they were more or less shunned. No other political parties wanted to work with them, not even the right, and their politics were unpopular in mainstream politics. But something happened over the years. As the Sweden Democrats grew, siphoning voters from all over the political spectrum, although most of all from the right. Other political parties started buying into the politics of fear and bigotry that the Sweden Democrats espoused. Other political parties, too, would talk more about the immigration issue or the refugee crisis from the perspective of how much is too much. Some more than others, of course, again, the right more than the left. Despite the political right chasing the Sweden Democrats in a rightward shift on issues of immigration, they kept losing voters. Despite the center-left Social Democratic Party moving to the center to appeal to more voters, Sweden as a nation has grown more and more polarized and right-wing, to the point where just 3 seats in parliament are the difference between a coalition of leftists and centrists or a coalition of right-wing conservatives and far-right fascists. A lot of the blame for the honestly frightening idea of the Sweden Democrats exerting power over the majority bloc in parliament can be placed squarely on the right, specifically the moderate party, the Christian Democrats, and the Liberals. Where all mainstream political parties used to refuse to work with the Sweden Democrats, these right-wing parties have this election in a bid for power in their desire for tax cuts and austerity strongly signal their willingness to not just work with the Sweden Democrats, but together create the majority bloc that gets to appoint the next prime minister and government. And indeed, that's exactly what happened after the right's narrow victory. In mid-October of 2022, the moderate party, Christian Democrats, Liberals, and Sweden Democrats voted in a new government, consisting of the former 3 in ministerial posts, and the latter setting the political agenda for the new government in what is known as the Tidö Agreement. Despite the new Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson of the Moderate Party claiming that none of the 4 parties that signed the Tidö Agreement got everything they wanted, but everyone got something, I see a lot of concessions to the Sweden Democrats, including ones that are quite frightening. And indeed, there is a lot of fear these days. People with immigration backgrounds scared of what their future looks like with this new government and the specific policies of the Tidö Agreement. This agreement has plenty of xenophobic, racist, and far-right provisions and rhetoric. Here are some examples of what the new government is supposed to do according to the agreement. Investigate the possibility of renting beds in prisons abroad, which means sending people convicted of crimes in Sweden to foreign prisons where conditions are usually worse. Of course, this won't be applied to white people, it will be applied to immigrants. Investigate the possibility of deporting gang criminals who lack Swedish citizenship without their having been convicted of a crime. So just extrajudicial deportations, I suppose. Enforce visitation zones that people convicted of gang-related crime, honor crime, extremism, or domestic violence cannot visit. How likely is it that this will be applied to white supremacists, do you think? And will there be a racial component in checking who is or isn't allowed where? Of course there will. Introduce double penalties for crimes linked to criminal networks. Investigate the possibility to lower the age at which children may be tried as adults. What demographic of people do you think will be more likely to receive harsher sentences and be tried as adults when they are underage? People of color, of course. Remember that a core aspect of the Sweden Democrats' platform is to paint a connection between immigration and crime, a much stronger connection than there actually is. Investigate a national ban on beggars. The context of this one is that poor people in the European Union, a lot of them Romani, don't look right, don't look like they belong. And there are plenty of far-right conspiracy theories about why poor people begging for money are actually horrible, deceitful predators. Unhinged xenophobia and racism. Classism too, of course, because beggars make well-off people uncomfortable. You don't want to see them, so just get rid of them. Remove the system of permanent residency. Remove residence permits in several cases, kind of vague. Increase knowledge about the possibility for repatriation. Remember here that repatriation is and always has been a Nazi goal for the creation of an ethno-state. It's a dog whistle. Tighten requirements for citizenship. so no permanent residency, much harder to qualify for citizenship, and encourage immigrants to leave, letting them know they don't belong here and aren't welcome. A person could live in Sweden for years, even most of their life, yet still not be considered worthy of living here according to this agreement. Deport human beings of bad character. This is deliberately vague, but there are some examples given. Lack of compliance with rules, association with criminal organizations, prostitution, because desperate women who sell their bodies not to die or who were outright victims of human trafficking ought to be punished even more by being deported. Substance abuse, because human beings, specifically brown human beings, ought to be punished for medical problems, you see. Involvement in extremist organizations. What's interesting about the last one is that it would apply to every Sweden Democrat Party official, yet this is a policy that will be applied lopsidedly only to people with an immigration background. Investigate problems associated with labor immigration. You know, the people who come here and steal jobs or something. Investigate whether new arrivals automatically should get access to social benefits and financial aid. Because refugees with nothing but the clothes on their back, who left everything they knew to flee war, should just be left to fend for themselves, I guess. These are some of the direct concessions made by the mainstream right to the far-right Sweden Democrats. And remember that these are concessions they got with just 20.54% of votes. If they ever get more power, enough power to form a one-party government, these policies would seem tame in comparison to what would follow. These are policies that are directly harmful to people of color and immigrants, are lopsided, and point to certain demographics as second-class citizens, if they can even become citizens in the first place, and arbitrarily try to define what and who is or is not Swedish. These are harmful policies that use dehumanizing and demonizing language aimed directly at immigrants and beggars, mostly people of color, and fearmonger about them, shaping a narrative that they are the cause of the problems that exist in society, real or imagined. It is frightening that 20.54% of Swedes believe that arbitrarily punishing and getting rid of certain demographics of human beings is the solution to problems they believe were created by these demographics even existing and cohabiting the same space on the speck of space dirt we call home. It is frightening that half of the Swedish political establishment is either far-right extremist or willing to work with far-right extremists. Because, forgive me for invoking Godwin's law, but what exactly is the difference between the Nazis pointing to the Jews in the 1930s and saying, they are the cause of all of our problems, and the Sweden Democrats pointing to Arabs, Muslims, and refugees now and saying, actually, they are the cause of all our problems? The mainstream right's willingness to work with and make concessions to the far right makes me fearful for the future because it further legitimizes the Sweden Democrats and sets a new precedent of accepting fascism as part of institutional politics. A significant further shift rightward of the Overton window, the socially acceptable spectrum of ideas and views to espouse and pursue politically. Maybe not much will change today or tomorrow, but what about next week, next month, or next year? Where will we be 4 years from now, 8 years, 12 years? With an ultra-conservative, ultra-nationalist party of fascism gaining more power, how will the country, the culture, and our rights change? I fear it's not for the better, but I suppose only time will tell. Anyway, thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe. If you have any thoughts or questions, please leave a comment below. It would help the channel a great deal. If you like my content, consider supporting me on Patreon with a small dollar donation. I will never paywall any content, but any support is greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode of Patucation.